Hello everyone, good day. This week, having completed our unit on Mesopotamian mythology, religion, and civilization, boy, looking at all this, we've sure done a lot, we are entering into our first week on Egypt. Notice a development here with our theme on goddesses in mythology. We began in Babylonian civilization looking at the character of Tiamat, and also at Ishtar in later versions of the Gilgamesh tale. From there, we tried to go even further back in history and understand a bit more about the goddess Inanna, reconstructing the Sumerian Inanna from the surviving sources, most of which were in Akkadian, was not always easy, but we definitely discovered that the worship of Inanna goes much further back perhaps even than the 3rd millennium BCE, and that Inanna has roots in Neolithic goddess worship. This week, we're going to read Armstrong's chapter on the Neolithic period, as well as introducing Egyptian mythology, this time focusing on another goddess with potentially Neolithic roots, the goddess Isis, and the myths surrounding her partnership with the god Osiris. There are certainly going to be a lot of parallels to explore between Inanna and Dumasil and Osiris and Isis. But first, a little bit about the Neolithic. For our purposes in this course, it might be helpful at this point to familiarize yourselves with the wikis on the Paleolithic period, the Neolithic period, and early historical civilizations. Paleolithic period dates to the dawn of the human species, although the richest sources of material cultural evidence we have for paleontologists from around 90,000 to 20,000 BCE. The Mesolithic period is often included in studies of the Paleolithic period. The transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic is often described as a transition from a hunter-gatherer society to the beginnings of horticulture and agriculture, and along with them more sedentary societies. 11,000 BCE for the beginning of the Neolithic is a bit early, as the heights of the Neolithic period are generally thought to be between 7,000 and 4,000 BCE. It seems that the Neolithic period received quite an impetus with the end of the last great ice age, which contributed to the drying out of the African Sahara, and thus the settlement of the Nile River, and hence the origins of Egyptian civilization, as well as resulting in increased biodiversity in many areas of Europe and the Middle East, including the Fertile Crescent between the Euphrates and the Tigris River. If you're interested in the relation of mythology and religion to the origins of agriculture in the earliest evidence, I would recommend The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture by Jacques Covin. And just for your information, the dates for the beginning of the Neolithic have been pushed steadily back by scholars in recent decades, in part because of the discovery of agricultural settlements like Göbekli Tepe. It seems that here, dispersed hunter-gatherer groups gathered for rituals and feasting on the basis of cosmological and ideological shifts that we can now recognize as the origin of organized religion. For the purposes of our introductory course on world mythology, we're going to get most of our information about the Neolithic from the Armstrong text, as well as from the documentary assigned this week on the life of the Lithuanian archaeologist Marija Gimbutas. Recall how Armstrong argued that the sky principle dominated in earlier Paleolithic human cultures. Her analysis in Neolithic societies, it is the earth that rules due to the shift towards an agriculturally based economy and religious structure. Again, be just a bit wary of Armstrong's slightly overconfident assertions, for it would be misleading to suggest that Neolithic myth and religion can be neatly reconstructed and categorized by scholars. Nevertheless, the idea that myth and religion changed significantly during the Neolithic period, especially humanity's mythological and religious relationship to the earth, seems pretty clear and substantiated. All the goddesses that Armstrong discusses in her chapter on the Neolithic we'll only learn about in much later sources. But there seems to be a family resemblance to them based on agricultural motifs. So in addition to Inanna and Isis, who we'll be studying in more details, as well Asherah, an early Canaanite or Israelite religion, as well as the Greek Hera, Demeter, and Aphrodite, have myths and practices of worship associated with them, which we can reasonably infer date back to the Neolithic period. As well, there are certain mythic motifs or mythemes by which we can recognize a potentially Neolithic goddess in later sources. For example, many of these mother goddess figures have consorts who are nearly torn apart, dismembered, brutally mutilated, and killed before they can rise again with the crops to new life. Here is a good example of one of those suspicious remarks from Armstrong. She writes, in the old heroic myths dating from the Paleolithic age, it was usually a male hero who set forth on a dangerous journey to bring help to his people. In fact, we don't have any clear written myths surviving from the Paleolithic period. And so this remark is speculative at best and irresponsible at worst. For an opposing view, you could pick up for your presentation, for example, Barbara Tedlock's book, The Woman in the Shaman's Body, which examines the burial sites of women shamans in the Paleolithic period. So I don't think we can read with Armstrong the Neolithic as a time when the female's hero's journey wins out over the males, men and male gods becoming helpless and passive. But rather, we should attempt to investigate Neolithic religion and myth without projecting totalizing theories like this for which there is no material evidence. Armstrong is an excellent Judeo-Christian scholar, and so I found her remarks on the Canaanite myth of Anat particularly informative. Armstrong does a great job telling Anat's tales, but not where the tale comes from. We actually learn of Anat only very recently from Ugaritic texts, which were written down in the 14th to 12th centuries BCE, and not discovered until 1929. Anat also seems to have connections to other Egyptian and Mesopotamian goddesses with the same name, and even perhaps with the Greek goddess Athena. In early Israelite mythology, Anat is a sister and spouse of Baal, the storm god, who undergoes a process of death and resurrection, similar to Dumasil and Osiris. Armstrong focuses on the parallels between Anat and the Egyptian Isis, who she oddly identifies as less powerful than Anat. Not sure where she gets that. She writes, Osiris, the first king of Egypt, teaches his people the science of agriculture. His brother Seth, who aspires to the throne, assassinates him, and Isis, his sister and spouse, roams the world like Anat, searching for his body. When she finds the corpse, she can only revive him long enough to enable him to conceive Horus, a son to continue his line before he expires again. Then Osiris's body is cut into pieces, and each fragment is buried like seed in a different place throughout Egypt. He becomes the ruler of the Duat, the root world of the dead, and is also responsible each year for the annual harvest. This is the myth theme of the fecundator god, usually in myths from the Neolithic period. Woman is spoken of in terms of fertility, while man is spoken of in terms of fecundity. Look it up. Dumasil, Baal, Osiris, Dionysus, and Adonis all exemplify this arguably Neolithic male archetype, which tends to be discussed more recently as the green man motif. I don't mean to be too hard on Armstrong because I really enjoy her book, but it doesn't seem to me that she's a big fan of Neolithic mother goddess religion. Marija Gimbutas would have some words to say about her first point here, that the mother goddess is not a redeemer, but the cause of death and sorrow. The French post-structuralist philosopher Gilles Deleuze writes in this book, Coldness and Cruelty, concerning the archetype of the cold or harsh mother, that whether she is a princess or a peasant girl, whether she is clad in ermine or sheepskin, she is always the same woman. She wears furs, she wields a whip, she treats men as slaves, and she is both my creation and the true Samartian woman. The cold and perhaps even sadistic goddess mother of the steppes, who is properly unmotherly towards human beings, as well as the Oedipal mother, whose role it is to protect the sons from the whims of the tribal chieftain father, and is thus uterine. Here's not the place to get into the modern psychology of the mother goddess archetype, but it's worth noting that just because this reconstructed Neolithic mother goddess of which Armstrong speaks is a bit harder in her religious requirements on humanity, shouldn't assume that her myths and worship were devoid of a redemptive element. Moving on to our selection for Egyptian myth this week from Aga Jafar, and also a textbook chapter on the myths of Osiris and Isis, we should note that we are speculating about Neolithic goddess archetypes based on much later sources. In fact, our main source for the text of Isis and Osiris comes from a Greek interpreter, Plutarch, in the 2nd century CE. Next week, we're going to study more recently discovered sources for Egyptian myth and religion, dating all the way back to 2500 BCE and through 500 BCE. But we're starting here because Plutarch, a Greek writer, ended up becoming the source for Egyptian myth. Thus, although Plutarch has proven to be fairly reliable, the myths of Egypt that he told were the myths of Egypt from the Western perspective for over a millennia. That is, until the beginnings of modern Egyptology and its development from the 16th to the 20th century CE, which we'll look at next week. Keep in mind that reverence for the goddess Isis spans over 3,000 years of Egyptian cultural history and did not decline until the 2nd century CE. And in fact, Isis worship is pretty prevalent today still. Isis could be understood as the Queen of Heaven, the premier mother goddess of the ancient Egyptians. With the rise of Christianity, Isis sanctuaries were rededicated to the Virgin Mary and Christ. Images of the goddess Isis nursing Horus just had to be divested of Egyptian iconography for a Mary Christ archetypal image to emerge. So when you're studying the Isis-Osiris story, first in Plutarch here, realize that it's a major foundation for Egyptian beliefs about salvation as well as the afterlife. And keep in mind, in terms of the pantheon of Egyptian mythology, that the Isis-Osiris story, which Plutarch relates, comes from the Ennead from Heliopolis, in which there are 9 main deities. More on this in a minute. Again, like in Mesopotamian mythology or cosmogony, that is creation myth, the Heliopolis Ennead myth involves an emergence from primeval water or Nu. Unlike in the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish, where Tiamat properly engenders all the other deities, perhaps even including her consort Apsu, the relationship to the feminine engendering principle in the Ennead myth attributes creative power and the genealogy of subsequent gods only to Atum, the sun god, or Atum Ra. There are then 2 subsequent generations, so this is again a myth of succession, quite similar to the one we find in the Enuma Elish. There we learned about Lamu and Lahamu, male and female versions of earth or silt. Here the first deities to emerge are Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture. And the subsequent generation of Babylonian deities were Anshar and Kishar, the horizon of the earth or the horizon of the sky. And here in the Egyptian version of the succession myth, we have Geb and Nut, the earth and the sky. The sky being feminine and the earth masculine in this Egyptian myth is fairly anomalous. Here you see the overarching figure of Nut, the sky, covering Geb, the earth. Although anomalous, the depiction of sky as female is not unheard of. Variations like this happen a lot in world mythology. In Greek mythology, for example, although Uranos is a sky god, there's also some myths regarding Urania, or a sky goddess. Again, like in Greek mythology, where the deities who are more ritually important and close to humans come in one of the later generations of the gods. Like in the Greek myth of succession, subsequent deities in the initial cosmogony are more important and ritually relevant for human life. The first generation of deities to emerge from Gaia and Uranos, the Titans, are still important and sometimes ritually recognized in Greek mythology, but they tend to take second stage in regards to the Olympian deities. Similarly, in Mesopotamian and in Egyptian myth, it's the 3rd or 4th generation of the gods who are most important for humans and who have the bulk of myths associated with them. In Egyptian myth, sired by earth and sky, we have a 4-fold of deities, including Osiris and Isis, and Seth and Nephthys. And then, a little bit like Marduk or Apollo, a savior god, here the child of Osiris and Isis, the god Horus. Here you see a map of Upper and Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt actually being what's lower geographically here, and Lower Egypt being what's higher. This is because of orientation by where the Nile flows out into the Mediterranean. You'll notice that there were quite a few, and this is just a very limited map of major Egyptian cities, which had their own scribal cultures and produced variant versions of mythology and religion. We'll be looking at the differences more next week. Now, Isis is a really cool goddess. In the Osiris myth, she incarnates the qualities of a devoted mother and wife, as well as a healer of the sick. She has magical powers. She is mother of the supreme pharaoh of Egypt, or the source of legitimation for the power of the pharaohs, namely Horus, the divine child, and later supreme prince and king. She is a nature goddess, and all of her myths involve mediation between birth, flourishing, and death. She is a guide through the underworld, or psychopomp, who leads the souls of the deceased to Osiris, where they become another Osiris and enjoy immortal life. This next point is relevant in light of the French theorist and linguist Georges Dumasil's trifunctional hypothesis. Dumasil suggests that much of cultural mythology for Indo-European and global peoples circles around three basic functional domains, that is, sexual or agricultural fertility, political sovereignty or rulership, as well as the martial or military dimension, and finally, the sacred. Isis has myths associated with all three functions. Her tears for the dead Osiris caused the Nile to flood, granting fertility to the land. Her miraculous child Horus legitimates the rule of successive pharaohs. And she is a nature goddess who can grant immortality to anyone who she shows favor to, magical, mysterious, and healing. In her periodization of Egyptian civilization through myth, Aga Jafar outlines the basic historical periods. Aga Jafar points out that there are in the Old Kingdom surviving fragments of the Isis on Osiris myth dating to the 27th century BCE. But these fragments contain precious little concerning Isis. The coffin texts from the Middle Period, in which spiritual initiations were increasingly shared with the noble classes and written on coffins, do contain more remarks on Isis, but usually in a more general capacity than the specific details of her myth. And Isis again appears in the Book of the Dead. Frequently, but usually not in such a way as to give many details as to her backstory. I should point out that there's widespread modern worship and revival of Isis religion and myth. Isis is a goddess who still garners many spiritual devotees. Isadora Forrest's book, Isis Magic, Cultivating a Relationship with the Goddess of 10,000 Names, is probably the best book in this oracular literary genre, since it is both a practical how-to guide for contacting and relating with Isis, and at the same time is quite well informed by the scholarship on her. Isis is often included in attempts to recapture the roots of African spirituality. More on this next week when we study Asant. And she was also fetishized extensively by the European romantics and idealists, by alchemists and esoteric practitioners since the Renaissance. Even Immanuel Kant writes positively of her and her temple inscription at Sayaz in his Critique of Judgment. The temple inscription is said to have read, "I am all that was, all that is, and all that will be, and no mortal has drawn the veil from before my face." This associates Isis in an ancient inscription as being a goddess over the past, present, and future dimensions of time and reality. And as well, it underlines the sovereignty of the goddess, her mysteriousness as a goddess of nature, who reveals herself or conceals herself when she wishes and to whom, and who no mortal has seen fully and completely, either naked or in the multi-dimensionality of her power. Isis, as a nature goddess of magic and esoteric wisdom, also became an organizing deity behind the movement known as Theosophy, and thus elements of her modern reappropriation had enormous impact on the intelligentsia and esotericists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Isis was all the rage during the occult spirituality that developed during the heights of modernism. And so, in a way, she is the original New Age goddess. Now, don't be confused when reading Plutarch because he tends to assimilate the names of Egyptian to Greek deities. Just use this handy chart. I thought it was funny that according to the myth, Isis and Osiris were in love in the womb and had incestuous baby god sex. Ew. According to Plutarch, Osiris's first act after being born was to deliver the Egyptians from destitution and brutishness by initiating them into the art of agriculture, and by founding religion, that is, teaching them to honor the gods. Also interesting is that Osiris is depicted as a pacifist musician king, wandering around, helping all the Egyptians out, teaching them, instructing them through song and music, and this is why he becomes identified for the Greek mind with the god Dionysus. If we were to apply euhemeristic interpretation of the myth, we might imagine that the original Osiris, back in a forgotten prehistory of Egyptian myth and religion, was a religious founder of sorts. Now at first, Seth, Osiris's evil brother, behaved under Isis's watchful eye. When Osiris returned home, he found Seth had formed a conspiracy against him in league with an Ethiopian queen. Again, euhemeristically, the deeds of Osiris, Seth, and Isis here may refer to a time of some political intrigue between Egypt and Ethiopia. Returning home from his civilizing missions among the villages, Osiris found himself in a feast prepared by Seth, in which we find the first instance of the mythological motif that we know as Cinderella's slipper. Yep, the slipper was originally a coffin, measured to Osiris's body, and very beautiful in a room where a great festivity was taking place. Seems a bit weird to us. Why would anybody want a coffin or even to be reminded of death? But you have to remember an ornate and beautiful coffin on which we can imagine written the coffin texts or instructions to the soul in the netherworld would have been one of the most cherished and treasured possessions of any Egyptian, guaranteeing his safe passage into the afterlife. As to this early period of development with respect to the myth, Plutarch doesn't seem to have all the details, but it could be that some myths discovered more recently fill out parts of the plot.
A woman in rags emerged from the swamp, flanked by 7 giant scorpions. Carrying a baby, she headed for the nearest village to beg for food. She approached a magnificent mansion, but the mistress of the house took one look at her grimy clothes and unusual companions and slammed the door in her face. So she continued down the road until she came to a cottage. The woman there took pity on the stranger and offered her what she could, a simple meal and a bed of straw. Her guest was no ordinary beggar. She was Isis, the most powerful goddess in Egypt. Isis was in hiding from her brother Set, who murdered her husband and wanted to murder her infant son, Horus. Set was also a powerful god, and he was looking for them. So to keep her cover, Isis had to be very discreet. She couldn't risk using her powers, but she was not without aid. Serket, goddess of venomous creatures, had sent 7 of her fiercest servants to guard Isis and her son. As Isis and Horus settled into their humble accommodation, the scorpions fumed at how the wealthy woman had offended their divine mistress. They all combined their venom and gave it to one of the 7, Tefen. In the dead of the night, Tefen crept over to the mansion. As he crawled under the door, he saw the owner's young son sleeping peacefully and gave him a mighty sting. Isis and her hostess were soon awakened by loud wailing. As they peered out of the doorway of the cottage, they saw a mother running through the street, weeping as she cradled her son. When Isis recognized the woman who had turned her away, she understood what her scorpions had done. Isis took the boy in her arms and began to recite a powerful spell. O poison of Tefen, come out of him and fall upon the ground. Poison of Befen, advance not, penetrate no farther, come out of him and fall upon the ground. For I am Isis, the great enchantress, the speaker of spells. Fall down, O poison of Mestet. Hasten not, poison of Mestetef. Rise not, poison of Petet and Titet. Approach not, poison of Martet. With each name she invoked, that scorpion's poison was neutralized. The child stirred, and his mother wept with gratitude and lamented her earlier callousness, offering all her wealth to Isis in repentance. The woman who had taken Isis in watched in awe. She had had no idea who she'd brought under her roof. And from that day on, the people learned to make a poultice to treat scorpion bites, speaking magical incantations just as the goddess had.
What a wonderful video, huh? I included it there because it gives another really good example of how disguise and ruse and also trickery play an important role in the narrative that is being spun between these four core Egyptian deities, Osiris and Seth, Isis and Nephthys. Easy to miss, but there is a classic sibling rivalry going on here between Osiris and Seth, as well as between Isis and Nephthys, since we know the jackal god of the underworld, Anubis, happens to be the child of Osiris and Nephthys, Anubis. Back to the earlier scene in this mythic narrative, the death of Osiris. Plutarch gives a fascinating detail here, remarking in Greek that Pans and Satyrs were the first to discover and mourn Osiris's death, quote, with a sudden confusion and consternation of a crowd which is called a panic. In Plutarch's mind, Pans and Satyrs are mythical creatures in the retinue of Dionysus, associated with both music and nature. Basically, they freak out and have a panic attack. Pan here being the Greek word for all things, or the all. I definitely see the respect here that Plutarch is giving to the death of Osiris. Since in Plutarch's own mind, Osiris, like Dionysus, is a god of death and resurrection, and thus of vegetative fertility at a very core level of the strata of mythical thought. And now we get to my absolute favorite part of the myth. Having heard about the reactions of fairy gnomes and creatures like Pans and Selene and who knows their Egyptian equivalents, to the news of the death of Osiris, we now get Plutarch's own intimate account of what Isis's own reaction was. Isis being a goddess of nature and magic, remember, and Osiris's wife. Plutarch writes, Isis, when the tidings reached her, at once cut off one of her tresses and put on a garment of mourning in the place where the city still bears the name of Copto. What to the mythical retinue was terror is to the goddess Isis the deepest deprivation. And note here that our first encounter with the great goddess Isis in action has to do with her emotions, her loss, grief, shock, deprivation, and subsequent mourning. Just imagine the most powerful goddess imaginable in her most extreme expression of those emotions. Eventually, Isis learns that the coffin has been cast up from the sea near the land of Byblus and taken up residence in a clump of heather or an erica tree. This would mean that after its exit from the Nile River, the coffin floated very far to the northeast. Notice also the stunning mythical image related to Osiris's powers as a god of agricultural and vegetative fertility. The dead god barks in the tree, and the tree becomes completely overgrown, serving as a wonder and a miracle in this new land, and providing the wood to create a pillar to support the roof of its king. What does Isis do? She heads off to build Byblus in disguise as a mortal woman and gets a job in the palace. Like Demeter at the Well of Maidens, her first act there is to sit down by a spring, all dejection and tears. Again, like in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, she is greeted by the queen's maidservants and treated with amiability. And Isis is taken up into the household as a wet nurse. Plutarch comments, some say the queen's name was Astarte, who has connections to both Ishtar and Aphrodite. The levels of direct comparison here between the tale of Isis and the Greek Demeter are pretty stunning, so much so that I've sometimes wondered if these could really be based on Egyptian sources, or if Plutarch, being Greek, is importing some details from the Homeric hymn to Demeter. It could also be that Plutarch is reporting the Egyptian myth correctly, and that the Homeric hymn to Demeter is itself influenced by earlier Isis mythologies. Isis nurses the queen's son by giving her finger to suck, and in the night she burns away the mortal portions of his body. This is exactly what happens in the Homeric hymn to Demeter when Demeter puts the infant son Demophon into a sacred fire. Additionally, in the Isis myth, and this portion is really quite beautiful, the goddess turns herself into a swallow and flits around the pillars of her dead husband with a wailing lament until the queen, who had been watching, when she saw her babe on fire and Isis flying around the pillar, gave forth a loud cry, and thus deprived it of immortality. Again, they might suspect a case of assimilation here of Isis myth to Demeter myth. Isis cuts the coffin out of the tree and throws herself on it in such a dreadful wailing. The younger of the king's sons expired on the spot. She then sets off with the elder prince of the kingdom in a boat made of papyrus. Later, opening the coffin and throwing herself upon the corpse, she is spied by this elder prince, and just the look of anger that she gives him causes him to die of fright. Isis's mourning and anger here seem a little misdirected, but also perhaps almost unintentional, for it is the mere sight of a grief so great and an anger so terrible which caused the princess to die on the spot. A little inconsistency. In this version, it seems like Horus is already born, but in other versions, she reconstructs the body of Osiris and sleeps with him one more time to produce the infant son. The whole cycle starts again when Seth finds the corpse of Osiris and divides it into 14 pieces, scattering them throughout Egypt, and Isis again goes on a quest to reconstruct the body of the dead god Osiris. It is after the second quest for Osiris and his second temporary resurrection that we find the comic scene of Isis being unable to find the male member, it having been eaten by a fish, and so consecrating a golden phallus instead. Osiris is sort of out of the picture at this point, except in his role as an underworld god, but the battles between now Horus and Seth have just begun. To conclude and bringing together the first half with the second half of the video this week, it is always a stretch to infer and reconstruct potentially Neolithic goddesses based on the goddesses with Neolithic connections in much later sources. Nevertheless, the presence of Astarte in the myths in Plutarch surrounding Isis, the close parallels between Isis and the Greek Demeter, the transformation of great mother and child imagery from Isis and Horus to Mary and Jesus, and in general the family resemblances among all these myths, would suggest a fairly strong basis for inferring or extrapolating that the roots of Isis religion in Egyptian and Western culture have some Neolithic elements going back to great goddess mother worship. I hope you've enjoyed your video this week, and we will try to get into a bit more of those details next week.